pause up here.
Okay.
And then resume up here.
Cool.
Okay, have a great round, guys.
Okay, so is first affirmative ready to begin?
Yes, I am.
It's the first.
Oh wait, should we have them to finish?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Luke said, oh, come on. Give thank yous.
I
Okay,
think
3,
the
2.
winners of the demo
Wait,
today
wait,
have
wait.
more weight.
Yeah. So as tradition in final rounds of most tournaments, if you make it there, it is like somewhat customary to give a very short, brief thank you speech prior to the game. That's like an off-time romance, except you're thinking, just thanking people. Okay, so feel free to do it. You don't have to if you don't want to. But yeah, exactly. For when you win states or when you win nats. So.
Okay, I'd like to thank all the counselors because you guys helped me improve so much. And I'm definitely going to use all the tips, like one by one, getting better and better. I want to thank all of the campers because they're just amazing and we love them. We're going to be best friends forever. And yeah, and I want to thank my partner, Sanvi, for being the best debate partner ever. I think we'll do amazing this season. Is everyone ready?
No, I'm just saying right.
Dude.
We affirm the resolution that the United States federal government should substantially increase its military presence in the Arctic. Contention 1 is maximizing minerals. Show 23 quantifies the demand for rare earth elements is expected to grow 400 to 600% over the next few decades. The U.S. must have unwavering access to REMs as they are the basis of all technology. But 3 days ago, Beijing announced that it will curb exports of the rare earth minerals gallium and germanium, and they're willing to cut off more. According to CON23, 60% of all mined rare earth minerals are sourced from China. Saunders explains that the whole U.S. economy depends on REMs, and Beijing is willing to use mineral supply chains as geopolitical leverage. The United States can no longer depend on China. The Arctic is the answer. Borgenson finds that the Arctic produces up to 40% of the world's rare earth minerals. Sergey 19 finds that the rare earths in the Arctic can be accessed and collected by countries. The Arctic allows the U.S. to be less dependent on China. Furthermore, the National Security Strategy of 2022 details the U.S. military plans will provide programs and security for critical minerals production. Increasing the U.S. military's presence in the Arctic will lead to the retrieving of rare earth minerals. Our impact is twofold. First, green tech. The Arctic Economic Council describes in the Arctic region, we can find many of the metals and minerals needed for the green transition. FedAct 19 explains climate solutions depend on rare earths. These elements are indispensable in solar, wind, energy, and electric vehicles. Robert 20 adds, getting to net zero carbon emissions will require rapid, radical green tech innovation, which is why there's so much demand for REMs. Millman states, a total of 7.4 million lives around the world will be saved over this century if the U.S. manages to cut its emissions to net zero by 2050. We must gain access to rare earth minerals and utilize them for green tech because new health data shows if climate change isn't reduced, it will cause 3.4 million deaths per year by century end. Second, national security. The U.S. military cannot afford any disruption to their rare earth metal supply. Clark 21 described that rare earth minerals are vital components of defense systems key to American military supremacy. Newman 22 elaborates that REMs fuel semiconductors. Frosh 23 states that semiconductors have become one of the most important components of modern warfare. CSIS 22 states all major U.S. defense systems and platforms rely on semiconductors for their performance. REMs are necessary for these defense systems that keep millions of Americans safe. Contention 2 is deterrence. Russia's presence in the Arctic continues to get more aggressive each day. Giles 22 states, Russia has conducted numerous operations in the Arctic that can quantify as provocative or threatening to other countries. While 23 furthers, Russia plans to use the Arctic as a staging ground for power projection and to intimidate European Arctic countries. But the U.S. presence in the region would deter Russia from expanding its military. Russia's military presence is becoming more aggressive than defensive. According to Reuters 22, Russia has 11 submarines capable of launching long-range nuclear weapons. 8 of them are based in the Arctic Koala Peninsula, according to IISS. On top of the missile that Russia has, they also have other weapons that could turn the coastline into a radioactive desert. The Washington Post concludes that Russia has sent spies to the U.S. and they're getting more and more aggressive. Burke emphasized that the U.S. needs military presence and response in the Arctic to prevent Russia from continuing to act rashly in the region. The impact is twofold. First, sustainable development. Gardner 23 explains that maintaining presence in the region is essential to not allow Russia to close off this region of the Arctic as its private domain. Ally 23 explained that Russia's development in the Arctic region lacks sustainability and will have a great impact on the environment, leading to extreme deterioration of the Arctic environment and even a rise in the sea level. Second, protecting U.S. interests. Cole 23 finds Russia's offensive goals in the Arctic and their actions could indicate a possible Russia-NATO conflict. ICANN states that with just one weapon launch, 91.5 million casualties would occur in the first few hours. The longer-term consequences would be 5 billion people starving to death.
Well, for thank yous, I guess first I have to thank the instructors. I feel like everything got better this week and it was much better than it was during season. More than that, I also have to thank all the campers as well. I think throughout the week we kind of formed like a camaraderie, and even during tournament it wasn't like toxic at all, which I loved. Especially Anne is like a camper slash coach. I thought it was really cool that she hears so much about her students. So that's wonderful. Yeah, thanks to my parents for sending me here, I guess. Oh, and Colin, of course. He didn't nuke me, and he didn't nuke me every time I messed up. So that was really fun. Okay. Is anyone not ready? Then I'll start my time on my first word. We negate. Resolved. The United States federal government should substantially increase its military presence in the Arctic. Our sole contention is on thin ice. Campbell 23 explains that for decades, the Arctic has remained an exemplar of international peace and cooperation over military competition. Indeed, Russia remains committed to Arctic diplomacy. Though Russia's membership in the Arctic Council had been suspended due to its incursion in Ukraine, Simpson 23 of Foreign Policy explains Russia peacefully passed leadership onto its fellow member Norway, which he could have easily have retained to append Arctic politics, signaling Russia's investment into the Council's survival. Moreover, despite fears of a Russian military buildup, rumor 21 of the Carnegie Endowment writes that increased Russian military presence in the Arctic is just military posturing, meant to secure Russia's territorial resources in the eyes of its people. In fact, Bella 19 of the University of Washington explains that because Russia already holds military dominance in the region, it is in its best interest to cooperatively resolve potential security issues to prevent other Arctic states from aligning against it. Unfortunately, increasing U.S. military presence would upend the delicate balance of Arctic peace in three key ways. The first is direct provocation. As Russia would feel the pressure to defend its territory, Colin 23 of the Statecraft Journal explains that a U.S. buildup could fuel military competition with Russia. It may be treated as a military provocation and result in increased Russian presence. Thus, Viller 17 of the American Security Project explains that U.S. militarization of the Arctic would worsen relations with Russia, threatening a regional arms race. Crucially, writer 11 of Sage Journals writes that arms races increase the likelihood of war by 331%, as tensions boil over into conflict. The second is by emboldening our allies. Increasing U.S. military presence incentivizes our allies to take aggressive war policies. Kavanaugh 18 of the RAND Corporation explains that U.S. allies see our commitments as evidence that the United States will always come to its aid, and if partners expect to share the action with a powerful U.S., they become more reckless in their foreign policy decisions. Indeed, Leeds 03 of Rice University explains that empirically, when allies think they have offensive partners to rely on, the probability of initiating disputes increases by 47%. Historically, Kavanaugh confirms that U.S. support for Georgia's accession to NATO emboldened its leaders to adopt a more provocative policy towards Russia that caused the 2008 war between the two countries. The third is by burning bridges. The Arctic Council, the sole multilateral institution in the Arctic, is crucial to maintaining peace. Gross 20 of the Harvard Review writes that the vast majority of legal matters concerning Arctic governance go through the Arctic Council, making it a crucial mediator in maintaining Arctic peace, even if its members may have disagreements in other policy areas. For example, last 23 of CBC explains that while the Ukrainian war has made it unpalatable for nations that hold bilateral scientific relations with Russia, the Arctic Council continues to hold multilateral coordination of science and data sharing. Unfortunately, because Russia would see U.S. militarization as backstabbing their goodwill, Alpha 22 of Columbia University explains that tension and secrecy could increase the risk of a miscommunication that would jeopardize cooperation and lead to a breakdown of the Arctic Council. Maintaining the Arctic Council is crucial, as Velasco 13 of the University of Central Florida finds that regional organizations like the Arctic Council are 7 times more likely to craft agreements that aren't broken for at least 5 years. For these 3 reasons, Press 20 of Foreign Policy writes that an increasingly militarized Arctic by both Russia and NATO countries would raise the stakes and likelihood of a potential miscalculation occurring in the region, and the conflict could go nuclear. European Council on Foreign Relations 20 explains that Russia would quickly escalate to the use of nuclear weapons to force their opponents into a quick capitulation in an escalate to de-escalate scenario. Unfortunately, Broad 22 of the New York Times writes that NATO would quickly respond with a nuclear strike to fulfill its security obligations, plunging both sides into a war and claiming 90 million lives. Thus, we negate.
Can I call for one of your cards? I think it was on your. Okay. Can I have the first question? Okay. So on your subpoint about the Arctic Council, you talk about how there will be a breakdown of the Arctic Council. Why will that occur?
Okay, so the Arctic Council is predominantly over science collaboration, right? So they don't want increased militarization of the Arctic uniquely. They have a bunch of indigenous groups who are on the council. They have like a vested interest in protecting their home. They don't want more militarization of the Arctic. If you're gonna have the US like be very aggressive, it's gonna like worsen all of these relations. And it's the sole multilateral institution governing the Arctic, right? So you don't want it to break down, because otherwise there's just chaos.
So I don't really understand how it would lead to a breakdown. The
Okay,
US military is just protecting its interest
What
about
interest? We just have like
rare earth-
Alaska. There's
about
just
rare
a little
earth
bit.
metals.
We have like a tiny piece of the Arctic. We don't need to
The US
substantially increase
needs
our
to
military
go.
presence.
The US needs to
looks-
go in the
Okay,
Arctic
one
for
second,
rare
can I
earth
just finish?
metals.
The thing is, it looks like we're being aggressive, right? Because we just have Alaska. It's like a very small part of the Arctic. So we're going to substantially increase our military presence in an area where we don't really have like any territorial claims on. It looks like we're being aggressive. The Arctic Council is not going to like that because they hate increased like militarization.
So
especially
wouldn't
when
they
you have
hate
no
Russia's
reason.
military
Okay, because
aggression too?
Russia is like fully defensive, and they've been doing this for decades. It looks like the US is doing it like randomly out of nowhere. That's what's going to be
So sending nuclear weapons to the Arctic is entirely.
okay, wait, can I just have like one question, please?
Yeah.
Okay, so you say that climate change is really, really bad, right? But what is like the greatest contributor to climate change?
Using fossil fuels.
It's going to be agriculture, right? So are there just going to be like no cows, no farming? Is there going to be nothing in your world?
I don't really understand your question because
Like, let's say, for example, like methane, right? Like 40% of methane emissions come from like cows and agriculture. So are there just going to be like no cows?
so
no
in your
farming,
world,
nothing.
you just I guess farming would happen in both worlds.
Okay, so-
but at least in our world, there would be rare earth metals, which give us a chance to actually solve climate change. Without
Okay,
rare earth
So
metals, we
about
wouldn't
these
have our
rare
phones,
earth
we
metals,
wouldn't have
where
our
is the production?
technology.
Where's the production capacity? This is in China, right? So even if we have access to them, we can't do anything with it. We can't process them.
So actually,
we're-
right after cross, I can show you that the US is currently increasing initiatives to be able to process. So the US is also actually bringing jobs and helping our economy by increasing processing. So you talk about one second. Oh, yeah, in the evidence that you guys showed us about there being like a 330% chance of direct provocation, that had nothing to do with like the Arctic or anything like that.
We're just saying like in general, right? It's studied like 100 plus of such conflicts. We say like historically there's like a 331% increase. That's cross. We'll take some crap.
Everything ready? I'll start my time.
Let's start on their only contention, on their sole contention on thin ice. they tell you that the Arctic has been peaceful. We tell you with multiple cards in our case that the Arctic has not been peaceful and that Russia is ready to be aggressive if the US isn't there to deter them. Look to our bird card. Then they tell you that Russia was in Arctic diplomacy and now they're not in diplomacy. But either way, the main thing that this tells us is that the Russia is not willing to cooperate right now. The issue isn't about trying to get Russia to cooperate with us. They're not going to cooperate. The issue is that we need to prevent them from instilling conflict. But then they tell you that from like their Bella 19 evidence that they already hold like dominance, so that's why they're like going to cooperate. If anything, if they hold dominance, that just tells us that it makes them more willing to like instill conflict because they have dominance over the region. What's stopping them? Why would that mean that they would want to cooperate with other countries? But then when they tell you that just like an increased presence equals a decrease in peace, this is just completely like non-unique because this is like never going to happen. Russia's never going to be diplomatic anyway. Russia isn't being diplomatic now. How is like the US just not going to the Arctic suddenly going to change Russia's like opinions on the United States? But then onto their first sub point on direct provocation, they say that like there's going to be military competition with Russia. What's important to note here is that Russia doesn't want to engage in a military competition with the United States. They're already like significantly weakened by Ukraine. They don't have the ability to like engage in this conflict with the United States. That's not the issue here, but the issue here is that they feel that they have dominance in the Arctic, and so they feel that they can extend their capabilities. But then they tell you that US militarization worsens conditions with Russia. Again, Russia is already on bad terms with the United States. The United States just stepping back and not going into the Arctic isn't going to like somehow like make their relationship with Russia better. There's no solvency. We're just telling you that if we just let Russia do whatever they want to do in the Arctic, it would lead to like conflict and really bad things would happen. But then onto their piece of evidence that tells you there's a 331% increased chance of war. This 331% increased chance of war comes from the arms race that's not going to occur because Russia doesn't have any arms to compete with in the arms race. They're not going to go into an arms race in the first place. But then onto their sub point beyond allies, they tell you that like the US, they tell you that like the allies are, because they feel like they're reliant on the United States, they're going to start like taking like bad measures. But the thing is that like allies aren't doing anything like bad right now. They're literally just submitting claims. And if anything, the US going to the Arctic just supports these people because Russia is ready to be aggressive towards them. That's why we provide you the evidence that they're having threatening nature towards these nations. The only way for them to not be threatened is if the United States is in the region. And their only example is from a war from 2008. That's like not enough precedent because especially since there's like a war in Ukraine right now, there's no like uniqueness to the status quo right now. But then onto their last sub point on like burning bridges, they tell you that it's hard for bilateral relations when like the US is in the Arctic. What's important to note here is, again, there's no chance for cooperation. They're trying to tell you that, okay, if the US isn't going to the Arctic, we'll cooperate. There's no chance. Russia doesn't want to cooperate anyway. It's best that the US stops Russia from taking aggressive measures. But then they tell you that they're 7 times more likely to craft an agreement if like the US doesn't go there. But this is number one from 2013. This is a piece of evidence from 2013 without Russia and the whole Russia and Ukraine conflict. So it's not applicable to this situation. But then they tell you that like Russia would bring in nuclear weapons. We just tell you that Russia is not willing to do that because of like mutually assured destruction. Because if the basically we're just telling you that if Russia is in the region, right, they can be aggressive and they can do whatever they want. They can like send off nuclear weapons. If the United States is there because of mutually assured destruction, they won't do that. But then let's just weigh really quick. So on scope, we tell you that climate change affects everyone, so our impact outweighs anything that they tell you. Also, we give you the time frame that if we don't increase our access to rare earth minerals right now, 7.4 million lives will be lost by 2050. We need the green tech. But then also we have solvency in our case for the biggest issue in our world right now, which is climate change. We have solvency for that. That's most important. But then also the main thing to note here is our narrative that if the US isn't mining for rare earth minerals in the Arctic, then Russia or China will. This is really bad because Russia has environmental deterioration and China uses human labor. Either way, in both worlds, there's going to be mining. It's just best that the United States does it so that they can improve their green tech and solve climate change. And that's why you can vote for the
We have 250 of prep.
I ended that. I'm so
Order is our case and then their case. Okay, is everyone ready? Yeah, perfect. If everyone is ready, then let's begin. Let's start at the top of our case. The first argument that they make is that Russia's not peaceful. That's their case. I'll get to it on their side. Then you can group the second, fourth response on this evidence. They both say that Russia isn't cooperative. They're misconstruing the argument that we make. We say that in the status quo, Russia is taking steps towards peaceful cooperation through the Arctic Council, because even if they were booted off the council in the first place, they had a like a unique reason to keep aligning because they want to keep cooperation and peace. That's why even though Russia like was not on the council, they still passed on leadership in a non-binding conference, which shows that Russia has a unique like position to keep peace in the region. The third response that they make is that they're not willing to use any force because they have dominance in the region, but they completely misconstrue the Bellin evidence that indicates that even if they had force, if they used it, it would align all the Arctic nations against them, which is why they've had a military buildup in the Arctic for decades, yet they've never caused any of the conflict like they talk about in the status quo. We'll go for our first argument about direct provocation. You can group the first and third responses that indicate that Russia doesn't have any resources because they're already engaged in Ukraine. That's not true, because what we would say, like they say themselves, is that Russia views the Arctic as a both cultural and strategic importance, and as a result has allocated resources in their reserves for that region. Then they say that Russia is already on bad terms with the US. Why would we want to, like, making them worse doesn't make anything worse? No, it does, because then we start war. On our impact, they say that Russia is not willing to use nuclear weapons because they have used because of math. Number one, this betrays the point because Russia feels like they can escalate the situation to quickly de-escalate and win a quick war. But second, they think that if Russia has the ability if Russia wants to compete in the region, they have to use strategic force, which is why they would escalate to nuclear weapons. And third, and probably more importantly, they also read nuclear war in their own scenario. So they're just fighting both defenses. What we would say is that this contradicts their own case. On the scope weighing, what we would say is that war is a fundamental prerequisite to their argument, their first argument about like climate change, because if there is a war, you can't do any of the mining or REMs because they'll be literally shooting at each other. No companies would want to invest in the first place. Let's go to their case. At the top, number one, Reuters and 20 writes that even if China controls all the processing, China controls all the processing for REM. So even if we mine them from the Arctic, we just have to send them back to China, which they would not do in the first place. They say that we're increasing production in crops, but it doesn't matter because the production it takes too long to allocate in the status quo. That's why we've been increasing production for years, and yet we still are incredibly reliant on China. But second, probably more importantly, what we would say is that even if the US doesn't invest, we can just buy the REMs from other nations in the Arctic, like Canada, who are also our allies. So it's not unique, and we can both get REMs in either world. That's also why their own argument and the evidence that they gave is not good, because it literally said that, as a whole, government agencies will just invest in the Arctic, not specifically the military. So we can just negate, and we can already get the REMs in the status quo. On their first argument about green tech, number one, we would say that even if you have all the even if you like switch to EVs and all the batteries, like all the stuff that they talk about, we will still have there will still be carbon emissions in the status quo, or not carbon. There will still be CO2 in the air that will have a greenhouse gas and trap like heat in the status quo. So even if you have reached net zero, you'll still get climate change. Finally, on their impact, they say that we need gallium and other stuff for semiconductors, but they've never empirically used it because gallium and those resources are not useful in a mass scale. That's why we've always used silicon, and we've never been reliant on the REMs that they talk about for semiconductors. Let's go to deterrence. We would argue that Russian aggression isn't true. They say that they've been increasing their submarine capabilities. No, they haven't. They've had those submarines in there for years. That's part of their second strike nuclear deterrence that they've had since like the USSR. Then they say that there's more spies. Literally, there's spies. The spies that they talk about are one, old, and two, they're like just not even part of the Arctic in general. Theirs are talking about ones that are like trying to infiltrate the CIA in Washington. So it's not even true. On substantial military presence, on their first impact, one, we would argue that the US doesn't have any claims in the Arctic, so there's no way we can stop Russian use of their own materials. Also, that would probably implicate to Russian sovereignty, so they would never bend to the US rules anyways. Thank you, and please negate. All right, are you ready for this?
I'll start across. Yeah. So in rebuttal, you say that we can just like buy from Canada. Is the US not better equipped than Canada to mine for rare earth minerals?
No, it's not.
Why?
Because they're already mining in the region. Like the whole point of your argument is that we need more rare earth minerals because the current place that we're getting them is from like China, who won't trade with us. But there are lots of big nations that are in the Arctic that we can trade with, like Canada. Like we have big agreements through NAFTA to trade through them. So there's no reason as to why the US uniquely needs to go into the region.
Well, it's because 60% of all of their like rare earth minerals are from China, so like it is significant. But then also like the
and like you say yourself, the other 40% are in the Arctic and getting mined by other countries like Canada and Norway.
Can I have your card after cost like other countries are mining? You can have a question.
Oh, Reuters card?
Like I don't know your card that like Canada's mining
That's
right
just,
now. And that
okay,
it's
number
fired
one,
from that.
that's like an implication of your own evidence, and two,
But-
and probably more importantly, it just makes like sense logically if you think, if you yourself say that other countries are in the region and have the incentive to mine REMs for the like points that you give to like stop climate change for EVs and for like military production, then they would already mining them in the status quo. We don't need. the US
We
in the
never
region.
said that other countries in the region are incentivized to like mine. We're telling you that right now, Russia and China are the only, like, if the US doesn't go in there to mine right now, then like all their dependence on China. Like,
Okay,
it would be
sure. Even
threatened,
if we
right?
take it-
We don't
if-
tell you anything about
Sure, sure,
Canada
sure.
or anyone mining in the Arctic, but you can have a question. We spent like a minute and 30 on it.
Okay, sure. We would contend that your evidence also is really bad and probably links into this narrative as a whole, because your evidence doesn't even talk about the US military needing to invest. It just says
Okay.
government agencies like civil and like public civil private partnerships that are already happening in the status
The
quo.
national strategy was
And
about military, and then talked about that, but you can have a question.
But okay, sure, but your evidence doesn't say it needs the military at all. So you're,
Okay, you can take a question.
okay, sure. Let's talk about deterrence as a whole. So let's take your argument at its highest ground, and let's say that Russia is already aggressing in the status quo, right? Like you say yourself. We would obviously contend that that's not true, but let's say it's true, and Russia's already aggressing. At what point do they think that they can start a war?
When they feel like they have complete dominance, no one's deterring them in the region, then yes, they would like start conflict because no one's
Okay, so
really
man, how many
stopping
more
them.
submarines and spies do they need? Like, what's the threshold for them to
So-
start conflict?
So the submarines and the spies that are in there, that just indicates that Russia is like willing to start conflict, but then also like we give you the evidence that Russia has done like aggressive and threatening operations to
Okay.
other countries. That's the most important piece. Of
Okay,
evidence
so
that
when
we
do they
give
start
you.
conflict?
Like, So
Tomorrow?
like when are they gonna start a like
3
they started
years?
conflict
A
if like,
decade?
I mean, like if they continue on this pathway where like they can't, where like no one's stopping them, then yes, they'll start it in like a few years. It's like probably what's gonna happen. That's why the US needs to deter them in the region.
Okay, sure. You can take a question.
So on your case, like on your sub point A on like provocation, you say that there's like a 331% increased chance of war if there were like arms race. Why would Russia engage in an arms race with the United States right now when they're like struggling?
Because one, they have vast military reserves. They're like the second or strongest military in the world with one of the largest military budgets. So
Okay,
they
but
have
who's the
actual-
strongest, right? Is the United States not the strongest? Why would they engage with Russia in an arms race? But you can have, I mean, that's cross.
Because they see the Arctic as a cultural and strategic importance.
Also, can I just have that part? Like Canada mining
And giving it to
and being
the
willing to give it to the US.
It's not analytic.
Okay, but do you have like any card saying that Canada's like mining or anything?
Or giving it to the US, like for that really.
Or that they have like successful mining in the region? Anything? No.
It's analytic.
Okay, but they're not mining in Canada. We'll take some prep.
That's the entirety of your prep time. Oh, I've got to pause for that. Oops. Whatever.
Is everyone ready? Okay. Judges, the key issue you should vote for today is maximizing minerals, our contention one. First, they try to tell us that that you can't do mining if there's going to be war, but as we stated before, there's not going to be a war. All their evidence is about an arms race, but they have no evidence that that's actually going to happen. Russia is very like in that region, they're very dominant, and they have no incentive to go to war. And second, they talked about all of these reasons about buying, like they talked about buying rare earth metals from Canada, but they never said that Canada has the capability to do that, right? If they never said that Canada is willing to do that, or whether or not they're mining enough to be able to give to the US and make up for 60%. If the United States is going to the Arctic, they would be able to address their own concerns. And if the United States doesn't go to the Arctic, then that means that Russia and China will go there. Russia, as we've already established that Russia is dominant in the region. So Russia is the one who would start mining for rare earth metals, and they would continue to do that. And their practices, as we stated in our case, are not good, and they continue to like push towards like non-climate friendly solutions. Now, we outweigh for our contention because 7.4 million lives would be saved if emissions are cut, and the only way to do that is with rare earth metals. They have no solution. We have solvency because by 2050, we need to save 7.4 million lives, and the only way to do that is rare earth metals. Now, onto their case about they talked about the status quo, and they talked about Russia wanting to cooperate. That's simply not true. There's not a single example of Russia right now cooperating with the Arctic Council. In numerous articles I can give to them afterwards, there's Russia was forced to give up their leadership to Norway. Norway took it from them. So that is not an example of cooperation. That's just an example of Russia not being willing to give up their power. Now, they talked about Russia having all of these reserves and stuff like that, but they are being weakened by Ukraine because Ukraine is currently winning. So that's just another example why Russia would not want to go to war. Now, for all of these reasons, I believe it's a clear AF ballot because we actually have solvency and 7.4 million lives that depend on green energy, and they give no other way to get this rare earth metals.
I believe you have 1 minute.
Okay.
Yeah. Just checking the recording. Just checking the.
I'll start on the way, and then I'll do their case next. I'll start my time with the first word. Let's disregard the fact that in the status quo, Russia's like not in conflict. They're not being like highly aggressive offensively. Like if we're going to buy their arguments, there should have been a conflict already. But let's leave that aside. War is going to be a fundamental prerequisite, right? You can't solve for climate change if they're all just shooting at each other. You can't mine for REMs if it's an active war zone, right? We both believe that like nuclear war is really bad, or any war scenario is bad. They're going to prioritize that more. They have their own nuclear war scenario. We have the strength of link. We're going to give you historical examples such as Crimea, Ukraine, Georgia. Every time the US has been in the region, Russia has lashed out. That is how we're going to have this nuclear war impact, or even any conventional war. Now onto their side of the flow. They tell you that like mining for REMs is like really, really good, and the US is going to do it if we have increased military presence. But let's leave aside the fact that their card doesn't specifically say military and it says governance. The issue is that there's these things called exclusive economic zones, right? So the United States can only go where they have their EEZs. They can't interfere in what Russia's doing. So Russia's going to mine for REMs regardless. So all their arguments about Russia mining REMs not being green exist in both worlds, because Russia's still going to mine in their EEZs if they think REMs are that important. So if they want to argue that we should only go through US REMs, we don't really have that many EEZs in the Arctic. We're not going to get any significant quantity of REMs. They're not going to trigger any of the impacts. And overall, their impacts are all non-unique. We're going to have climate change anyways. See what Colin tells you. Like even if we get to net zero emissions immediately, there's still going to be CO2 in the air. We're still going to have climate change. And regardless, REMs are not going to solve for all of climate change. Climate change is going to exist in both worlds. It's still going to trigger the impact. They try to tell us specifically that onto their second contention that Russia's not aggressive right now. If Russia's not aggressive, because they're like, that's how we won't see any war. If Russia's not actually aggressive, then we don't need deterrence at all. They try to make this claim that Russia's not going to do anything. They're not going to have this nuclear war. If they're not going to have nuclear war, if they're not going to be aggressive, then we don't need to do anything. That cuts out their entire case. Now onto our side of the flow. Again, they try to tell us that Russia's not being aggressive, but we agree. Russia isn't being aggressive. They're just building up their defensive military capabilities. This is just posturing. Look at our rumor card. And then again, look at our Belen 19 card. They don't understand the warranting. We're telling you that if Russia uses their military capabilities in an offensive manner, every Arctic state will ally against them. That's how they're going to lose really, really badly. So they're not going to do that unless they're directly threatened. That's why we're going to vote on our arguments about a direct provocation. Again, historically, Crimea, Ukraine, Georgia, every time the US has threatened them in their sphere of influence, that is when it has led to aggression. That is how we're going to access our impacts of nuclear war. They tell us that Russia is not going to have any arms. A, Russia views the Arctic as really, really important and they have reserves in place. And B, they say that there's been this military buildup for a long time. There's been a military buildup for a long time in the region. They can just use those resources. And even then, see, like if there are no resources, they can just do a nuclear strike that leads to our impact way better than theirs. Now onto the actual, they say that Russia won't go to a nuclear war. Don't regard that at all. We both have nuclear war scenarios. We just lead to it way better. That's you negate.
Okay, we're ready for ground concept.
Y'all can ask the first question.
So you said in your summary that there's like different economic zones, so like the US and like Russia won't affect the United States or something. So how is the US be in the Arctic threatening Russia in any way if they have separate zones?
Because
anyway?
that's like military, right? Exclusive economic zones is for economic benefit. So that's stuff like mining. So the US can't go into Russia's EEZs and mine their stuff. There's no way to actually prevent Russia from mining it. They have like territorial claims to 50% of the Arctic coastline. They're going to get the vast majority of the EEZs anyways, because you argue yourself that no other nations are doing it. So we won't even be able to get it from other nations like Canada, stuff like that. So we're gonna have like no access to REMs. Why would we even
So
expand?
sure, even though like Russia's mining whatever, but the US needs rare earth minerals, right? And
Okay,
currently
how
giving
big
the
are
cards,
our
can I finish my
EEZs?
response? So our card and like you just like completely disregard our card that tells you that the Arctic is the best place for the United States to get rare earth minerals right now in order to stop their dependence on China. That's the issue, right?
Okay, but
It's the best
how
option for the United States right now. They essentially have no other option. They need rare earth minerals.
Do you recommend
fuel
we
their
break
economy.
international law and just like don't listen to EEZs? Like we don't have as much territorial claims as all these
No,
other nations.
we're saying that this is the best option for the United States right now. This is the best way for them to decrease their dependence. Otherwise, their whole economy will collapse. All of our impacts are going to be triggered because China will just literally cut off their whole rare earth mineral
Sure,
supply.
that's why your 2022 Strategic Defense Survey or whatever says that government agencies are already investing in the region and we don't need the US military. So we can already negate. in
We
order to
said
get
that
all
they're
the benefits.
investing in being able to.
Sure, okay, sure,
Also,
sure,
but no,
sure.
but also one
Sure.
other thing is that was like the US military strategy for the Arctic. Like that's
Yeah,
what that piece of, that's what
but-
that document was.
But your thing about the US military strategy, the specific part that you cite and gave to us never said that the military had to invest. It said that overall government agencies were already in the region, already investing, that were not military like at all. So at your highest ground, your argument is already being solved for in the status quo, and we can negate and not need any of the benefits of military.
Okay, so what we would tell you is that yes, we do need the military to mine for the rare earth minerals because we need like infrastructure to mine. We can just like walk in and mine. Like the military needs to be
The
there
military
for
doesn't
the infrastructure.
build
So we
Military
can
doesn't build
infrastructure.
But like I mean, they don't build infrastructure, but like there's like they can't just like show like the military needs to be
Right,
there.
like they
in
would
order
be able to
mine.
like establish some sort of law there for the private companies who are doing the mining.
But like
Never does that need the military though. Like we don't like for mining in the US, you don't need like the military and to build up reserves and stuff to like build drills. It's gonna be done like through private corporations
Yeah,
that
but
are
they would-
allied with the government. I think regardless though, your evidence just doesn't talk about the need for military use at all. So I'm
Okay,
pleased
but
with
like
it.
basically we'll just tell you that that was the detailed idea for the US military strategy in the Arctic and what the like and that was basically what the military would be like trying to achieve in the Arctic. That's what that whole strategy was telling us.
So
That
it's
was
being
literally the
solved in
military
status quo.
strategy.
Yeah.
So it's being
No.
solved in the status quo then.
No, it's not being solved in the status quo, saying that's what the US would have tried to do like if they go in with the military in the Arctic.
Oh shoot.
Yeah, no.
start time.
The most important argument for you to vote on in this round is our contention 1 on maximizing minerals. Their only main response in this case is that we can just go in like without the military for rare earth minerals. We tell you that the United States military strategy specifically details that they will try and achieve getting minerals through their military. We're not saying that that's happening right now. We're saying that's what their strategy would be for the Arctic. That's why we need to increase their presence there. But then they completely drop all their responses on our impact on green tech and national security, flowed both of those impacts through. But then let's go on to their side of the flow, and their main piece of like offense that they have is that like, okay, like Russia can cooperate right now. They're trying to cooperate. If Russia really wanted to cooperate that bad, why haven't they just like directly tried to join the Arctic Council? They try and like prove to you that like Russia is trying to cooperate and that like there's no need for the United States to be there. The main thing to know is that Russia does not want to cooperate. And then even on war, we both agree on mutually assured destruction. War won't happen. That takes out their whole impact because they agree with us that okay, Russia won't engage in nuclear war because of mutually assured destruction. That takes out the only impact that they have on their case, which is their 91.5 million lives. We tell you this won't happen because both countries don't want to engage in a nuclear war and both countries don't want to engage in an arms race because the US is obviously militarily more significant right now, especially with Russia and Ukraine. But on weighing, the most important thing to note here is that the whole entire US economy is dependent on rare earth minerals and China is threatening to cut them off. The best option for the United States right now to get these minerals is in the Arctic. They try and tell you this is insignificant. We tell you the US has no other option. The only way for the US to even get minerals and have a chance at preventing China from completely cutting off the minerals is through going into the Arctic. And we tell you that the only way that we can develop green tech that would save 7.4 million lives by 2050. Again, we also give you a time frame here while they give you no time frame on anything. We tell you the only way we can save 7.4 million lives by 2050 is if we mine for these rare earth minerals and then also just flow through on our second impact on our national security, where we tell you that they're very important, that like the REMs are vital for like the semiconductors. They try and tell you that they're not reliant, but they just ignore all of our cards. And that's why you can vote for the app.
I'll start on that case real quick. Okay. Is everyone good? Yeah, perfect. If everyone is ready, then let's begin. Let's ignore the fact that there's not a true link extension in their final focus, and let's look at their only impact that is like actually substantial and has and is internalized. The one about green tech. The only problem with this analysis is that they've completely conceded Shakti's second response. It indicates that even if you go net zero, there's still carbon and methane, like other greenhouse gases, in the atmosphere, and as a result will continually trap heat within the atmosphere, causing climate change. So even if you go net zero and get all the benefits of REMs, you can't solve for all of climate change. That, and also their second impact about national security just isn't internalized, so you don't have to go for it. Let's go to our case though, or let's go to the weighing, because the prerequisite is pretty clear and it's pretty conceded. War comes before all their arguments to the ground, because if there is a war, you can't mine for any of the REMs, all the infrastructure just gets destroyed. The only response, there's one, no response on it, but two, the only other thing that they said in summary was that there's not going to be a war because Russia isn't aggressive in the region. That's exactly the point. Russia already has military dominance in the region. That's why they've never utilized it, because if they did, they would align all Arctic nations against them. All they say is that Russia isn't bound for cooperation. That one betrays the point, because Russia, even though they've been building up militarily for decades, they've never done the war that they talk about. That's why the region has been completely peaceful, and that's why there's no need to affirm. But when you affirm, our argument about direct provocation is pretty clear. It indicates that Russia sees the US military as a provocation that fuels competition and increased Russian presence and increases miscalculation and leads to the inciting of war. All they say is that they have no resources like Ukraine, but this blows past Shakti's response that one, it's a strategic and cultural importance, and two, they already have tons of reserves in the region that they can utilize. That's why Russia is the third or fourth biggest military in the world. That's crucial, because if there's a buildup and miscalculation, that probably causes something like nuclear war as NATO gets drawn in, killing 90 million lives. The only response here at the bottom is that mad deters. Number one, this wasn't in summary, but two, and probably more importantly, if Russia understands that the US is threatening their sphere of influence, they will lash out. Empirically, what has happened in places like Georgia, Ukraine, Crimea, history speaks against them. That's why you need to negate.
Pause this.